Thanks very much, Olwen. So good afternoon. Welcome everybody. It's great to see so many colleagues across the city join us. So hopefully you're all here for the right reasons. So this is a Keeping Bristol Safe webinar that we're hosting, and we've got two excellent facilitators here today to talk from two of our partner agencies. So the content of the webinar will be looking at the new harmful sexual behaviour protocol and looking at that protocol for professionals all across the safeguarding system in Bristol, so from different partner agencies. So just to touch on some practicalities, the webinar will be recorded, as I touched on, as people joined the room. That's to make sure that professionals that aren't able to attend the session today have access to the materials and the learning points from the webinar around the protocol. So the webinar is going to take around a 45-minute presentation with the use of slides visually on the screen by the facilitators, and then there will be a question and answer session afterwards. We're aiming for around a 15-minute Q&A session at the end, and as my colleague touched on, that won't be recorded, so the question and answer session will be informal for us to discuss any learning from the webinar today. Before we move on and I ask the lovely facilitators to introduce themselves, I'm going to open with a self-care reminder. So just to remind ourselves, it's really important to look after ourselves when we talk about safeguarding topics, and in particular harmful sexual behaviour that we're going to look at today in terms of that protocol. So just recognise that we all come from different professional and potentially lived experience backgrounds around this particular safeguarding theme and topic. So just a reminder, please take care of yourselves. If you need to step away from the material and the content today and decompress, please feel able to do that. And just remind yourself to take care of yourself after the session. So if you find that there's been an impact based on what we've discussed today, look after yourself and reach out to those support structures and those support systems that you've got available to you. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Louise and Stephen, our facilitators, to introduce themselves and begin the content of the webinar. And I just want to thank you both for your time in coming to deliver this content today to our colleagues across the city. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Nat. Afternoon, everybody. I'm Louise Catlin. I'm a Detective Inspector on Operation Ruby, which is our child protection team, and I cover Bristol and the north of the force for Avon and Somerset Police. Also have Stephen.
Hi, I'm Stephen Barry. I'm the clinical team manager and lead for a service called Be Safe. We're part of specialist CAMS in Bristol, and we do also offer services in some other areas. I also have another role actually for the next 6 months as a practice improvement advisor for the Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse. So thanks for this opportunity to present to you.
Okay, we can have the next slide, Matt. Get into this. Right, afternoon, everyone. So first of all, we go through the aims of harmful sexual behaviour and the objectives of what we're hoping to achieve with the webinar today. So it'll be giving you an overview of what harmful sexual behaviour is and different types, new changes and updates to the protocol published in May 2022 and consider the impact on our practice, and final messages for key takeaways and remaining core principles. Another next slide, thank you. If I read out for you the definition. So harmful sexual behaviour, also known as HSB, is a developmentally inappropriate sexual behaviour which is displayed by children and young people and which may be harmful or abusive, and that was derived from Hackett in 2014. We'll also refer to the NSPCC definition of 2019, one or more children engaging in sexual discussions or acts that are inappropriate for their age or stage of development. These can range from using sexually explicit words and phrases to full penetrative sex with other children or adults. Harmful sexual behaviour encompasses a range of behaviours which can be displayed towards other children, peers or adults. Harmful sexual behaviour is harmful both to the children and young people who display it, the people it is directed towards, and those who may indirectly be impacted by it. This could include harm involving contact or non-contact. Okay, next slide, Matt.
So we've just grouped this as types, and I mean that may or may not be the right term, but it is important to think about harmful sexual behaviours or sexual behaviour on a continuum, and Simon Hackett's continuum is included in the protocol, which is really useful because it looks at behaviours from normal, that might not be quite the right word, but through to abusive behaviours, which harmful sexual behaviour encompasses all of those, so includes inappropriate, problematic, abusive and violent behaviours. We also need to think about technology assisted or technology facilitated. I think there's some debate about the language, or internet enabled harmful sexual behaviour. So that's behaviour that occurs online, and it can happen in a range of contexts, at home, at school, out in the park, because, as you know, technology is everywhere, actually, with our phones, our laptops, our iPads and so forth. And it covers a range of behaviours from inappropriate use of pornography, and we're seeing increasing evidence that pornography is influencing some children's sexual behaviours and some very young children, which is actually quite worrying, right through to behaviours of sharing sexual images. And that might be through that term that used to be used a lot, and I'm hearing less nowadays, such as sexting. It might also include what we'd call online sexual abuse and grooming. So there's a range of behaviours to think about, and we've seen a dramatic increase since COVID. But over the last decade, and I have been working in this field for many years, most probably far too many, that, you know, there's been a massive increase in technology and its influence on children, young people's behaviour, but also adult behaviour. It's also important to think about what we mean by sexual abuse, and obviously some of these definitions will be very familiar with you. So that idea of forcing or enticing a child or a young person to take part in sexual activities, but that would also relate to adults as well, and the protocol looks at some clear definitions around that, issues around consent, the use of force, age differentials, differentials also in power, around abilities and so forth. So we're talking about a range of behaviours when we're talking about sexual abuse. So we also think about sibling sexual abuse, but as recently more referred to as child-sibling harmful sexual behaviour. So that idea of one child or young person in the family sexually harming another child in the family. That could be a brother, sister, step brother, foster brother or sister, to use that term, cousins. So that term can be used quite broadly. And the Centre for Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse has a paper available specifically around that. SARS has, so the Somerset and Avon sexual assault referral service also has resources on that through their sibling sexual abuse project, where they look specifically at this area. So it's be worth looking at those areas, but it's an area that was clearly underreported and not recognised previously, and is seen as the most common form of child sexual abuse within the family, but often underreported and not recognised. There's also idea of thinking about pair-on-pair or child-on-child, or you might prefer to say peer-to-peer or child-to-child abuse, sexual abuse. So we're thinking about particularly school education settings, for example. So the terminology, once again, is being discussed and debated, but it's that idea that one child of a similar age harms sexually another child. And also thinking about criminal child exploitation, so often referred to as CCE, and child sexual exploitation, and the crossovers around harmful sexual behaviour are really important to think about. We also need to consider children and adolescent development. So, you know, sexual development is a normal part of children's development. So we need to think on a continuum where they are and whether those behaviours fit within normal development. It doesn't mean you don't intervene, it doesn't mean you don't redirect, but it's really to think about the developmental context. Thanks, Nat.
Okay, so we move on to prevention now. So children and young people spend a large quantity of their time in education settings and in the community. Therefore, supporting schools, community settings to develop a culture where HSB are recognised and addressed is really important. The protocol highlights that we all have a role to play within the safeguarding system to ensure prevention. This will look different for each setting, organisation, depending on whether you play a primary, secondary or tertiary role. And for example, most professionals will play the role of a primary setting, therefore would have the responsibility to raise awareness and educate, dispel myths and enable identification of risky behaviours. The other sectors therefore would take the lead on intervention and therapeutic support. Next slide, Nat.
So some other changes in the protocol highlight the importance of early intervention is key. So picking up on concerns early on. And I think it's also important for me to think about primary, secondary, tertiary and quaternary, which is a term that Karen McCartan has come up with in terms of different levels of intervention. So that primary level of raising awareness, public awareness, our own professional awareness, which this is part of. Thinking about secondary, so looking particularly and thinking about at-risk populations and where best to intervene with our particular concerns in people's histories through their behaviour. So intervening early, so early intervention. Thinking about the tertiary level, so that'd be thinking, you know, where harmful behaviour has happened and then intervening using evidence-based types approaches. And that quaternary level, which is about that idea of, you know, young people or adults for that matter who are coming back into the community, so rejoining the community. So that whole idea about successful integration and services like circles of support and accountability offer support to those who have engaged in harmful sexual behaviours to reintegrate into the community as an example. So that sense of belonging again, rather than continuing the sense of social isolation. So thinking about age, development, risk and need. So we're balancing up a range of factors when we're thinking about intervening. The importance of assessment and intervention. So what are the assessment frameworks out there? So one that's often talked about for adolescents is a tool called AIM3, which balances out strength and concern factors, considers what the key risks are and needs for the child or young person is. What needs are they trying to meet in an inappropriate or harmful way through their sexual behaviour, for example. Using that assessment and doing a collaborative assessment with the network around the child, so it's multi-agency, but it also includes the parents, carers, child and young person as appropriate. And then letting that inform intervention. So the levels of assessment will depend on the level of concern. So think about the least intrusive types of intervention and letting it fit. So the service like mine, which I'm going to talk about shortly, you know, works with young people anything from 6 to 18 months and in some cases 2 years. But other lower level interventions, which might be more education based, might be more appropriate. So we really need to think about what are the potential factors that influence the behaviour. And those factors may include experiences of childhood abuse, for example. Domestic abuse is not uncommon, neglect, emotional abuse, and obviously sexual abuse. And the service that the young people Be Safe work with have a range of those abuses and tend not to just be one abuse experience. We also need to think about the impact of adverse childhood experiences on children's behaviour. And that might be a factor that we sometimes use the word a driving factor behind the behaviour for meeting needs in a harmful and inappropriate way. So we need to also think about how we work with trauma. So that idea of trauma-focused or trauma-informed practice is really important. We also need to think about that for parents and carers who may also have experienced abuse and trauma themselves, and how that might play out in their parenting, and how that may also be disruptive and harmful to the children. Intervention should be flexible and clearly planned and informed by good assessments and reviewed regularly. And I would argue they need to be they might be individual, group-based, they might be systemically based, in other words, working with the parents, carers and the whole family. They'll also be important, those interventions link in with the network supporting the child so that there's clear agreement on the best approach. And they must also be embedded in safety planning and risk management. So for our service, if someone is referred to us, we always ask, is there a safety plan in place? Is it written? Does the child, young person, family, school, etc. know about that plan? We have a range of templates we do share with services and guidance for doing that. So it's putting it within what we call a safety plan, but some people might call a risk management plan. And it's really important we think about the needs of children within education. And in Bristol, we have a very good safeguarding schools team who do a lot of work around supporting schools to do that. We have a number of calls at Be Safe from schools about how to manage behaviour and think about a proportional response, but also how to keep young people, children at school. And if I think about some examples as a service, we've advised on safety plans and worked alongside a school, a parent, to think about, should this child go on the school camp, for example, and is that a safe option? And sometimes it's not just about the sexual behaviour we need to think about. If a child becomes highly anxious and may become quite disruptive on the school camp, we really need to think about that. But are there other things they could do to still be included that might mean not going on the school camp, but might mean going for a day? So it's really important we do think about inclusion, but that we need to work together about that and not just expect schools or education colleagues to just hold that on their own. It's a shared holding of risk and safety and working together. Thanks, Nat.
Okay, if we move on to multi-agency response. So first of all, be a referral to first response. Upon first response receiving a referral from any organisation, setting a threshold decision will be made from the information that they have available at that time. The possible outcomes of the referral could be an NFA, no further action, with signposting to relevant support services, early help, which is under Section 10 of the Children's Act, or child in need under Section 17. Or it could be that there's a strategy discussion where the child is at risk of significant harm where it meets Section 47 of the Children's Act 1989. There should be separate practitioners aligned to the child experience and the child causing harm, and we should be considering children causing harm within strategy discussions also, so not just the child victim. Where there are multiple children involved in the same harm incidences for the child-on-child abuse, a complex strategy discussion should also be convened. It is vital that we ensure the right people come together within our multi-agency discussions, and as a minimum this should include children's social care, be safe, police, health, including CAMS where appropriate, yacht where the child is age 10 plus, and education. Then we go into safety planning. The safety plan will look different for each individual case, and the child will need to consider the views of key partners, the voice of children and voice of families. This could include risk factors associated with the home, school, community environments. The safety plan should be communicated across the multi-agency safeguarding system for all children involved, and the plan also needs to consider the strengths and the needs of the children causing the harm. The plan should be reviewed every 3 months or when changes occur, and for those children returning home or into the community after any custodial or residential stay, and should be reviewed 6 months prior to their return. So in relation to support, the safety planning process and any assessments being conducted should include appropriate support for the child and the children involved and the family, and these include therapeutic and recovery-based support. This support should be available regardless of whether the child is experiencing or causing the harm. And then we look at vulnerability versus the criminal justice lens. Most young people who display harmful sexual behaviour do not reoffend sexually as adults. Statistically, young people are more likely to get into trouble or be arrested later for non-sexual abuse and other problematic behaviours than for sexual crimes, and that is from Hackett 2014. It is not inevitable or even highly likely that most children with HSB will go on to perpetrate sexual abuse in adulthood. Therefore, professionals should always consider the behaviour through a vulnerability lens, whilst balancing recognition of the impact on the child and the children who experience the harm. Despite seeing this through the vulnerability lens, this does not negate the need for appropriate intervention where required. Have the next slide, Matt, thanks. We move on to obviously the police process input. So the first bit I wanted to sort of go through with you is the criminal responsibility. So at this time, the age of criminal responsibility is 10 years and over. So from a police perspective, we would still record on our system and be involved in any multi-agency discussion, even if the child is under the age of 10, but obviously below the age of criminal responsibility. The police have to consider within the early stages within multi-agency discussions whether this will progress within a criminal investigation and whether the person causing the harm is identified as going to be treated as a suspect or a victim. Criminalisation should be a last resort, but there will be cases where it will be required. The police play an integral part with regards to considering safety versus enforcement, and that's to ensure we consider the safety for all children involved within all our multi-agency discussions. And this would include being part of considering the safety planning for the home, school and community settings. There could be various outcomes. One we've already said is like no further action, could be a community resolution, a youth caution, or a charge for an offence. When we look at CPS prosecution considerations, if the police are going to progress a criminal investigation, we would seek early advice from CPS. and this is to consider whether the evidential threshold will be met, but also the need for earlier therapeutic intervention for that child causing the harm, the child suspect, so that they can get that therapeutic help earlier on. Police should also be seeking the views of all our partner agency professionals before we go to CPS, and that's obviously our Crown Prosecution Service, and that's to consider all the views as part of their decision making. This would take the form of the multi-agency discussions, and relevant factors for the CPS to consider include the age, the understanding of the offender, whether they have been exploited or coerced, similarity of the children involved in terms of their development, and consider that if there's any power imbalance, the nature of the relationship between those involved, especially considering if they were in a position of trust, disability, neurodiversity of the victim, what is in the best interest or welfare of the child suspect, and the nature of harm. For example, was it a penetrative offence or non-penetrative? And public interest test. Is it actually in the public interest for the victim suspect, as public interest in the community, and what would be the impact of a prosecution going forwards? That's sort of where we look at it from a police point of view. Nat, next slide.
So just to talk a little bit about Be Safe, which, as I said before, works with children and young people where there's concerns about their harmful sexual behaviour. The service is a small multidisciplinary team based within what we call specialist camps, so the Child and Mental Health Service, and we have social work trained staff, psychologists, systemic family therapists, and staff who also have psychotherapy or counselling training in their backgrounds. And we offer a range of approaches, which I've tried to highlight there. So we think about assessment and therapeutic intervention. So we're currently developing a 4-stage assessment process for an initial assessment, for example, which would start with a multi-agency meeting, including the referrer and usually the parent carer, but not always, but we'd usually prefer that. But there may be some reasons, for example, around safeguarding or points of clarity we need where we might decide not to include the parents. Where we plan out the assessment, agree the safety plan, then we might go on to thinking we need a more thorough assessment, so a comprehensive assessment, which might be partly informed by recognised assessment frameworks such as AIM 3 or the AIM Under 12s assessment framework. And that would be a very comprehensive assessment that would be undertaken with the parents, carers, the young person, child, and also talking to key professionals involved with the young person or family, and also looking at key assessment reports, social care chronology, strategy minutes, for example. So that's one way we may work with a family, and we have a range of intervention programs that are evidence informed, so they may be individual, group, or family therapy. And I think it's really important with younger children, we emphasise engaging with parents, carers first before we would see a child. We also need to agree that it's the best approach. So that's why we offer consultations, because we often get calls from schools, for example, or social workers or children's centres where they're worried about a child's sexual behaviour, and we can talk through how serious that is, how that fits along the developmental norm, and decide with the school or the social worker or families in focus worker what's the best approach, or with the police. So we may have calls from the police about cases. We also offer consultation to the strategy meetings as part of the protocol, as was mentioned by Louise earlier. So if there is concern around harmful behaviour, we will be invited to those meetings to give advice. We do offer training because it's important that we resource professionals, and we do contribute to the Keeping Bristol Safe Partnership multi-agency training. And I think there are a couple of training events coming up shortly, led by my colleague Alice. And we also do offer training specifically around a program called Keep Safe, which you see on there, which is a group and family intervention we've developed alongside Kent University, Tizard Centre and others, aimed specifically at young people with learning disabilities who have engaged in harmful sexual behaviour. We also run a program that has been on hold because of COVID, but will be starting again shortly, which is a children's program for children aged 7 to 11. It's offered as a group, but also family intervention, and is informed by a trauma-focused CBT approach, as well as psychoeducational approaches, as well as parenting approaches. and includes 18 sessions when it's delivered as a group that run at the same time for parents, carers and children, and 5 of those are joint sessions. But that would only be offered after an assessment, and there may be other sessions added in to support that work, because we might need to also offer family therapy alongside that, for example, or individual work with the child or young person. It's also important that we think about circles of support and accountability, which our service links to, which is a voluntary sector agency in the southwest that offers support to young people and adults where there's concerns about sexual behaviour. Those places are now funded, but they have a group of volunteers who support the young person in the community, and they have some. It's a very good agency. The volunteers are well supported and trained. They tend to have people on their board or coordinators who have either worked for probation or in the youth offending service and understand the risks around harmful sexual behaviour or sexual offending in adults. And if you wanted to access that service for a young person, there are costs involved in that. We've also been involved in restorative project in the past with the Greenhouse, which offers support services for children and families where there's concerns around sexual abuse. And we work closely with them, particularly in sibling cases where there's been harmful sexual behaviour. That does not mean we'll have a face-to-face meeting, which is what people often think about when we talk about restorative justice. What it means is we think systemically and broadly about the needs of all the children, the child who's been harmed, as well as this child who's been harmed, and other people who may also be impacted within that. So as you can see, we offer a broad range of services, and it's also okay just to ring up our service for some general advice, and we'll send through suggested resources, websites, books, etc., that you may or may not be aware of, and talk through the worries. Next slide, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. So yeah, this is the final slide over to me. So just we wanted to finalise with some key messages that we wanted you to take away. They've been touched on already by Louise and Stephen throughout the presentation, but just as a final reminder, those kind of core principles that we're looking for. So you'll see them on the slide there. So firstly, prevention is key. So we've talked about how we raise awareness, how we have that culture of vigilance and being able to prevent and identify. Early identification, so actually being able to just see when we identify harmful sexual behaviour, whether that's the person that's causing it or the person that's experiencing it, and then being able to intervene in the right way. And when we think about the right way, it's already been touched on by Louise and Stephen, but firstly, being flexible, so adapting to the needs of our community, being trauma informed, and we've got trauma informed kind of framework and principles across the city to be a trauma informed city, but particularly important when we think about harmful sexual behaviour. That multi-agency response, so I always use this as a visual aid, so thinking about how we come together in the right way in the safeguarding system, and building that multi-agency response. And you'll see there the right people at the right time with the right support available. And that's again for children that cause and experience these types of behaviours. And then the last bit, when we think about balancing, as Stephen touched about that vulnerability, so we still need to absolutely look through the vulnerability lens that we've touched on, but we also need to not lose sight of the fact that we still have risk there and that we need to intervene. So we don't lose sight of the vulnerability and the experiences, but we also balance by looking at assessing that risk and offering the correct safety planning and assessment around that risk together across the system. And then just to touch on some of the links, I will pop them in the chat function imminently when we go over to the question and answer session. So you've got the links directly to the protocol that we've given the key messages for today within the webinar. And as Stephen touched on, his colleague Alice from Be Safe is going to deliver on behalf of the partnership a interagency, so multi-agency course around harmful sexual behaviour that will touch on not just the protocol, but actually in practice, how do we address and how do we support in the right way. There is a session in November coming up, and there's also a session in February 2023, but I will put the link in the chat function so people that would like to book onto that course have the availability to do so. So at this point, Olwen, if I could ask you to pause the record button, and then we will open over to question and answer